Classic Treasury. Magical Stories. The Mermaid and the Boy, from Andrew Lang's Brown Fairy Book. Long ago there lived a king who ruled over a country by the sea. Once he had to leave his wife to visit his subjects in some distant lands. The king set off on a long sea voyage, but his ship soon ran upon a rock and was stuck fast. Suddenly a mermaid was seen dancing on the waves that threatened every moment to dash the ship to pieces. "There is only one way to free yourselves," she said to the king, "and that is to give me your solemn word that you will deliver to me the first child that is born to you." Just then a huge wave broke with great force on the ship's side, and the king's crew fell on their knees and begged him to save them. So he promised, and this time a wave lifted the vessel clean off the rocks into the open sea. In the fullness of time, a year after the king had returned home, he was overjoyed when the queen gave birth to a baby boy. But from that moment he and the queen lived in terror, wondering if their son was to be snatched away. When the prince was 16, the king and his wife decided that for his own sake it would be best to send him into the world, for then perhaps the mermaid would never find him. The prince was delighted at the thought of adventures. He prepared a knapsack, bade farewell to his parents, and set out. All day he walked till evening drew in. He was just about to stretch himself out on a soft, mossy bank under a tree when there was a fearful roar, and a lion stood before him. "Give me some food," said the lion. "It is past my supper time, and I am very hungry." The boy was thankful that the lion did not want to eat him, that he gladly picked up his knapsack and held out some bread and a flask of wine. "I must be off now," remarked the lion when he was done, "but if you are in any danger, just wish yourself to be a lion, and you will become one on the spot. One good turn deserves another, you know." The prince thanked him for his kindness, and the two then bade each other farewell. Next day the boy again walked until evening drew in. Then he prepared a sleeping place in some ferns. Suddenly there was a crashing noise, and the boy saw a huge black bear thundering towards him. "I'm hungry," cried the bear. "Give me something to eat." From his knapsack the prince took out his second flask of wine and another loaf of bread. "I must go now," said the bear when he was done. "But when you are in danger, just wish yourself to be a bear, and you will become one. One good turn deserves another, you know." And the boy and the bear bade each other farewell. On the third day, the prince again walked until evening drew in, whereupon he threw himself down under a tree to rest. Then he heard a great buzzing over his head. "I am hungry," said a bee in a cross voice. "Give me something to eat." The boy took his last loaf and flask out of his knapsack and laid them on the ground. They had supper together. "I must be off," said the bee when he was done. "But if you are in danger, just wish yourself to be a bee, and you will become one. One good turn deserves another, you know." And the bee departed. Next day the boy walked and walked until he entered a great city. He listened to the people's gossiping and heard much talk about the king's only daughter, who was extremely beautiful. The prince waited until everyone had gone to bed. Then he wished himself to be a bee and flew through the keyhole in the front door of the palace, up the great stairs, past the guards, and through the keyhole into the princess's chamber. Then he turned into a man again. The princess, who was awake, was so startled she couldn't even scream. She just sat up in bed, gazing at him in silent terror. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I shall not hurt you." And he began to praise her gardens, of which he had also heard the people speak, and the birds and the flowers that she loved, till the princess's anger softened, and she answered him with gentle words. Indeed, she was so charmed by the prince that she vowed she would marry him, and confided to him that in 3 days her father would be off to the wars, leaving his sword in her room. If any man could find it and bring it to him, he would receive her hand as reward. At this point, the youth jumped up hastily, saying, "Of course! I shall ride with the king to the war, and if I do not return, take your violin every evening to the seashore and play on it." Just as the princess had foretold, in 3 days the king set out for the war with a large following, and among them was the young prince. They had left the city many miles behind them when the king suddenly discovered that he had forgotten his sword, and though each and every one of his attendants immediately offered theirs, he declared that he could fight with none but his own. "The first man who brings it to me from my daughter's room," cried he, "shall not only have her to be their wife, but after my death shall reign in my stead." At this the young prince, a red knight, and several more turned their horses to ride as fast as the wind back to the palace. But suddenly a better plan entered the prince's head, and letting the others pass him, he wished himself to be a lion. Then on he bounded, uttering such dreadful roars that the horses were frightened and grew unmanageable, and he easily outstripped them and soon reached the gates of the palace. Here he hastily changed himself into a bee and flew straight into the princess's room, where he became a man again. She showed him where the sword hung, concealed behind a curtain, and he took it down, saying, as he did so, "Be sure not to forget what you have promised to do." The princess made no reply, but smiled sweetly, and slipping a golden ring from her finger, she broke it in two and held half out to the prince, while the other half she put in her pocket. He kissed it and ran down the stairs with the sword. On his way back to the king, he stopped at a stream. Unbuckling the sword, he flung himself on the ground for a long drink. Unluckily, the mermaid happened at that moment to be floating on the water not very far off, and knew he was the boy who had been given to her before he was born. So she floated gently up, seized his arms, and the waves closed over them both. Hardly had they disappeared when the Red Knight came by. He could scarcely believe his eyes when he saw the king's sword on the bank. He fastened it to his belt and carried it off to the king. The war was over, and the king and his company returned. The princess saw to her great dismay that her true love was not among them. Moreover, the king told the poor princess that the Red Knight had won her fairly, and that the wedding would take place the very next day. That evening, taking her violin under her arm, the princess crept down to the shore as she had promised the prince. "Listen," said the mermaid to the prince, who was lying stretched out on a bed of seaweeds at the bottom of the sea. "Listen, that is your old love playing." "I hear nothing," answered the youth, who did not look happy. "Take me higher where the sounds can reach me." So the mermaid took him on her shoulders and bore him right up to the surface. "Can you hear now?" she asked. As soon as the prince thrust his head and shoulders into the air, he wished himself to be a bee and flew straight into the pocket of the princess. The mermaid looked in vain for him all night, but he never came back, and never more did he gladden her eyes. But the princess felt something strange was about her, and returned quickly to the palace, where the young man at once resumed his own shape. Oh, what joy filled her heart at the sight of him! But there was no time to be lost, and she led him into the great hall where the king and his nobles were sitting, feasting. "Behold the gallant prince who fetched your sword by the powers of his great magic," the princess announced. "To prove it, the prince turned himself into a lion, and the Red Knight quaked with fear. Then the prince turned himself into a bear, and the Red Knight hid behind the princess. Then the prince turned himself into a bee and stung the Red Knight repeatedly until he fled the palace, never to be seen again. How the king and his nobles laughed with joy! The princess drew out her half of the golden ring and showed how it fitted the prince's half. The next day there was indeed a marriage feast for the princess and her true prince. The end.